As of recently, the Question has been a character that has been getting talked about a lot. In all honesty, I don't know where it's been coming from. Even I have noticed myself talking about the character more often than I ever have on this channel. I do believe that this character has a lot to offer, but is just not being used in that way. But a lot of the comments on this unpopular opinion post go into who the greater detective is, either Batman or the Question. So with that being said, let's get into some of those comments and see what some of you had to say. So we're going to start with two comments, opposites of opinions, that do go into the conversation of who is a better detective. So starting with Geometric Chump, who says, the Question should be the world's greatest detective. The Question is solely a detective, whereas Batman, without that title, is still one of the best hand-to-hand fighters in the verse. He has his great wealth and some of the most advanced gadgets and vehicles in the world. He can still be a great detective who perhaps specializes in certain fields like criminology, but the Question's unparalleled ability to find connections and important clues without access to advanced technology like the Bat computer, like in Justice League Unlimited, should beg him the title. Batman said it himself in JLU. If anyone can find a link between Cadmus and Luthor, it's the Question. If the Question was the world's greatest detective, it would greatly increase their importance within the DC universe, and I think that's a good thing. And then to counteract that is Zach Coates. I don't think the Question is a better detective than Batman, but I think they are in a way equals. I like the idea that the Question approaches cases in a far different way, often considering things Batman would not consider, yet also missing some details Batman catches. And it would be very amazing to get a series of the two bouncing off each other and solving mysteries. I believe they could potentially have amazing chemistry, especially if it is earlier in the Caped Crusader's career. So two very good points on opposite reasons why. Now, there is a huge correlation on the world's greatest detective being Batman. We have seen so many iterations of Batman where he truly is the world's greatest detective. Then there are some times where he might not be the smartest Batman we've ever seen, or he misses some of the easiest clues, which makes you question if he is the world's greatest detective. And maybe from that instance, the Question should be the world's greatest detective, considering he does have a look far more suited to a detective than Batman. Now, as we all know, the creation of Batman is from the 30s. The creation of the Question is from 1960s, and I think it's 1967 to be exact. However, Batman has been given the name of world's greatest detective since the 40s. But from what I've been able to find online, some of the very first instances he was called the world's greatest detective was around the early 60s, and the Question was created a couple years after that. So in all intents and purposes, Batman owns that title, but maybe it is okay to hand that title off to someone else. Over the years, we have seen Batman handle detective work far easier in the terms of technology, using computers, using detective vision, using other gadgets to help his ability to solve cases and crimes, in which, like Geometric said, the Question doesn't usually have those instruments or even need those instruments to solve cases. Now, you could argue, is that Batman relying on the technology, or is that just Batman using the tech because it makes things easier, it makes things better, and that way he can get more of the job done at a quicker pace? And that is the one I would personally go with. I don't think Batman would be lost without his tech. I just think it makes things much more simple for a man who always has something on his plate. But I also think Zach here makes some really good points, because I like the idea of them being equal. Maybe there is not an answer on who's smarter and who's more easily equipped to take on these conspiracies or crime scenes or mysteries, whatever it might be. Maybe they can both work in tandem, and maybe because they are so smart, they get along much better with one another. And I even make mention of that in a recent video I did about DC characters who should team up much more often. So realistically, I am on neither side of this conversation, but I do like both of your guys' points. I find myself right in the middle. Brown Destroyer. I would give him a few interesting powers, like 1, when he touches something, he can see who last touched it, and 2, he can track by concentrating on particular sound of unknown particle, foot movements, amongst other sounds in nature. I've never thought about something like this for the question in any way, but I think it is really cool that you have. The question, once again, is a detective, solves conspiracies and mysteries. Giving him tracking-like abilities is actually really genius for the character. Nothing to make the question too overpowered in a sense, because that would kind of defeat the purpose of who the question is, but it would at least help him with the ability to maybe make his job a little easier. And I know we were just praising the character on the fact that he doesn't need any outside sources or materials to be as good at what he does, but just for the sake of it, maybe giving him these tracking abilities or something like a psychometry could actually make people realize that the question is so good at what he does because he does have these certain abilities. Ovil. He works better as a secondary character, like when you can't get Batman, you go to the question. As a main character, he's just not interesting, or at the least, he needs someone to bounce off of. I don't know if I can really argue with that. Most of my experiences with the question does actually come from times where he is working with a group of people or simply with someone else. A lot of people have been mentioning how the Dennis O'Neil run from the 80s is one of the best runs for the character, and I've actually never read it. I should, but I would argue that maybe the people who have read that comic would say that he can work on its own. The question is a superhero noir. It brings you into that darker side of the DC universe, which I would argue is one of the more bigger selling points to DC. If you could just get the question in that realm, you could potentially find yourself in a situation where he does work on his own and doesn't need to work off the success of anyone else. Possibly. I'm just taking a stab at it. I think there's even a possibility that the question could work in a DC universe through a form of a live action TV show where you modeled him after the Daredevil show. Very gritty and edgy within reason, and also give the question this side of extreme violence. Not saying he just wants to hurt or kill anybody, but saying that that is who he deals with, and he needs to exact that violence on the people he faces up against because it's what they do to others. And it's also how he's going to get down to unfolding a mystery. Putting him in a darker depth situation of Gotham City that maybe you don't see, or maybe in his own city of Hub City. It really gives the character potential and how he could exist by himself. Tombstoner Forever. I know there's going to be a lot of comments saying that he's underrated, he should be used more, I want to see him in live action. But genuinely, I don't see the hype surrounding this character. Sure, he plays a big role in the comics, but I don't really find him all that interesting. Honestly, it's fair. I disagree to an extent, but I completely understand. Like I've said, the popularity and the want or the need to have this character show up in live action all of a sudden does feel like it has come out of nowhere. I can even say that for myself. I don't know why all of a sudden I really want to see this character. I just do. I do feel like the question's involvement is not enough to tamper with someone's excitement on DC Comics as a whole, whether you're going to use that character for your particular comic book, live action show, video game, whatever it might be. Sometimes the question can be a character that is just there. Sometimes he is much more important than that. Overall, the importance that has been played up on this character as of recently does not match how I think the fan base would have viewed the character over the past couple of years, or even 10 or 20 years. So it is very interesting that he is getting hyped up so much in such a short amount of time. UniverseChronology. Renee Montoya shouldn't have taken over as the question. I love Renee. She is a really cool character to me, but she didn't really add anything new to the question. She was just question but a woman, and her becoming the question didn't really advance her character either, besides making her a superhero. I'd much rather Renee remain a detective in the GCPD because she works very well there, and keep Vic as the question. I'll be completely honest, I always forget Renee had a stint as the question. I think it is very forgettable. I also am not a huge fan on Renee Montoya myself. When I think of all the Batman characters out there, all the important GCPD members, I don't often think of her in the first place anyways. DC and just frankly comic books in general, they always try to pull something like this to get another character who's not popular, maybe a little more popular, to get their name known more than it currently is, making characters superheroes when they were never even a superhero in the first place, and that is essentially what they did with Renee. There were a couple of people on here saying they liked it, but I would argue there were a lot more people on here who said they didn't like it. To me, yeah, the question is Vic. It's always been Vic, and always will be. Retro Rampage. I feel like you could clear a good 50% of Batman rogues and give them to the question. He's severely lacking in villains, and I feel like a lot of them would be better suited for him, like Clayface, Victor Zsasz, and obviously Riddler. I had a feeling a lot of the comments on the question were going to have some sort of affiliation with Batman, but I definitely do think this is bold. I don't think many Batman villains could be given to the question. I think of the ones you mentioned here could be Victor Zsasz and Riddler. I do know that the question and Riddler have gone up against each other before, but it hasn't been enough. Batman's rogues gallery has been built up to be one of the best of all time. I just don't think we need to be pulling villains away from him to give them to other characters. Creators need to do just that. They need to create interesting and compelling characters, so maybe create interesting, compelling villains for the question. However, some of those could work considering a lot of them are about murder and mystery. Victor Zsasz could work, Riddler could work, and hear me out, Clayface could work. Maybe not so much the actual clay monster that Batman would go up against, but perhaps you could have two Clayfaces. You could have the original Clayface who wears a disturbing mask and goes around killing prolific people, and then you could eventually get the Clayface who is made of clay that Batman will focus on. Basically, the first generation of Clayface is who the question will have in his rogues gallery. I do think maybe villains like that could work, the Court of Owls, maybe even Hush, but overall, I like Batman having those villains, and I think the question just needs to get better crafted villains for himself. Alright, so now for my unpopular opinion. I like the idea that the question wears no face. You don't necessarily know who he is, but I also like this idea that maybe even he doesn't know who he is. And one of the biggest mysteries that he actually has to uncover is who he is. Now, I know there's this whole thing of him being part of the Trinity of Sin and his real identity was robbed for him, and it could work maybe in certain ways, but it would be very neat if the question was maybe a supernatural essence over all times of history, maybe spreading back 2,000 years. Every couple of generations, a new person is marked by the question. Somebody who must go faceless, somebody who has to relieve their identity to become a detective, a mystery conspiracy hunter who has to track down and solve some of the most important conspiracies and groups of people, or even just singular people of all time during these points in history. Essentially, as all of these questions have existed over time, no one has ever truly known who that particular person is. They've never been able to see behind the faceless mask, or even if that faceless mask is actually their face. And even too, if you look beyond modern day and at all points in history, the question has always left a calling card, some sort of mark of just a question mark, or maybe something a little offsetting from the Riddler. What makes Vic Sage a little different is the fact that he is to become the first question in history who not only figures out his true identity that was stripped from him when he became the question, but he also realizes why the question is in existence today, why the question is such an important piece of a DC universe, which is arguably the biggest question of them all. But there you go, guys. That is my unpopular opinion on the question, and there are some of your unpopular opinions. So as per usual, if you didn't get the chance to do so in the community post, you can now leave some more unpopular opinions on this character in the comments below, and also leave some comments of other characters you would like me to add to the unpopular opinion character list. That is all I have for you on this one, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it, and until the next time, I will talk to you all very soon.